welcome back to my channel. For those who don't know me, my name is Katharine, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about my quarter 3 reading updates. I've done my quarter 1 reading updates, I've done my quarter 2 reading updates, now it's time for quarter 3. I can't believe we're already this far into 2025. I've accumulated a few questions that I'm going to answer for you all, and hopefully this is entertaining for you guys to listen to and to watch. So let's get to it. I drew these questions from here, there, and everywhere, so I can't really credit this whole video or set of prompts to anyone in particular. I just kind of came up with a lot of these questions just from a bunch of different places. So let's just get into it. Starting off with the first question I have here, it's how many books have you read so far this year? Have you met your Goodreads reading goal? And I've read 86 books this far in the year, and that's really surprising to me because I did set a goal of 50 books to read in the year of 2025, and I've already surpassed that goal. I forgot to mention in my quarter 2 reading update, video a few months ago that by that point I had already surpassed that goal. So I apologize if I didn't include that in my last quarterly reading update video, but I have surpassed my reading goal challenge for Goodreads in that respect, and that's really cool to think about. I think a lot of it has to do with how I'm reading, and that's mostly by audiobooks because just the nature of my job being a DoorDash and Uber Eats driver full-time, so I'm able to listen to a lot of books in my car. But anyways, I also wanted to mention too that the 86 books I did DNF 13 of them. So when I do DNF a book, I usually like to give books a chance. So I'll read at least 10% of the book, which sometimes if it's a longer book, that's a decent chunk. I've read books that are over 500 pages. So if I DNF it at 50 pages, that's 10% of the way through. And I think 50 pages of a book is a decent chunk. So I do count it as read on Goodreads because I do think that 10% is a decent amount of time out of my own life to be giving to a book that I didn't necessarily enjoy and I ended up DNFing. And for those who don't know, DNF literally means did not finish. So that's what that means if you didn't know. But I do count it as marked on Goodreads because of the pure fact that I did take time out of my own life to read these books that I unfortunately didn't fully complete, but I technically did read them, so that's why I count them as read on Goodreads, and they're an automatic 1-star if I do DNF them. That's what I'm trying to say if I can speak English today. So 13, like I said, 13 out of the 86 books that I've finished this year have been DNF. So if you subtract that from the 86, that means that I completed in full 73 books. So you can count it either way. I must have finished at least 73, but it says on Goodreads 86 because I DNF'd 13. So you can count it either way. So it's either 73 or 86. I'm going to count it as 86 because of the fact that I did take time out of my own busy life to read those books. Unfortunately, I did not fully complete them, but I did, take time out of my life to try to read them. So there you go. That's that answer. The second question is, what was your favorite book so far this year up until this point that you haven't, mentioned in other videos? And I would have to still say, well, actually, I did mention this in another video because there actually hasn't been a book that has lived up to this book so far this year, and it's still the book by Amy Harmon, What the Wind Knows. And I mentioned that in my quarter 2 video for my reading updates, And it's essentially a historical fiction about this girl who time travels back in time in Ireland. It's a great book. I love it. It's my favorite book so far this year, and I mentioned it like I did previously in my quarter 2 reading updates. And it was a really great book. I definitely suggest reading any Amy Harmon books. The third question is, what was your biggest surprise read as of yet this year that you haven't mentioned before in previous videos? And I haven't mentioned this book in any of my reading wrap-ups this year because of the fact that it's going to be in my October reading wrap-up, which will be in a few weeks from now, so keep an eye out for that video. And that's Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I don't know what it is, but I am realizing that I do actually like classic books. I didn't realize that before because of the fact that I had to read a lot of classics in school. And when I had to read books for school, it just like went in one ear and out the other, like right over my head, and it was more of a chore to me. So I never necessarily considered myself like a classic book lover, but I'm slowly figuring out like what classic books I do like. And that's to say, like, I don't like all classic books, just hear me out there, but I do like some. And Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte definitely surprised me because of the fact that the themes in it were so beautiful. Charlotte Bronte's prose are like stunning, like she writes so beautifully, and I felt myself so engaged throughout the book. Essentially, it's about this woman, well, actually not even a woman, it starts her off as like a young girl, and she goes through a really tough childhood. She is, orphaned as a child, so she ends up being, brought into her aunt and uncle's house, and then her uncle dies, and so she's being taken care of by her like aunt essentially, but her aunt through marriage, and her aunt like doesn't like her, so she sends her off to like almost like a boarding school slash orphanage, and it also serves as a school too. And then once she leaves the boarding school slash school, she becomes a governess, and the majority of the book is about her being a governess. And there's like a really awesome love story in there as well. So it's just like a very complex book, but it also wasn't confusing, which is what I was worried about because it is such a long book. But I just recently watched the movie because I like watching the movie after reading the book, and I watched the 2011 version movie of Jane Eyre, and it was like amazing. I think it definitely captured like the essence of Jane Eyre, and although there was obviously things that I wish they had added to the movie, like there's certain things that were missing, like overall it was a great movie. But yeah, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte was definitely a huge surprise for me. The fourth question is, on the opposite side of the spectrum, what was your biggest disappointment? And that would have to be The Lost Boys of Barlow Theater by Charlotte, what am I talking about? Not Charlotte, I was just talking about Charlotte Bronte, by Jamie Jo Wright. So again, The Lost Boys of Barlow Theater by Jamie Jo Wright. And I have been trying to read a lot of Christian fiction throughout the past like year or so because I was really getting sick of like a lot of the mainstream like secular fiction, if that makes sense. I was not liking a lot of like the demonic themes in a lot of mainstream books, as well as a lot of like the smutty, spicy, lustful type themes as well in mainstream secular fiction. So I was like, well, maybe I just need to start reading Christian fiction from now on because that seems like it would be something that I could possibly like. So in the past year, I've definitely read like a good chunk of Christian fiction, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good Christian fiction out there. Like I love Francine Rivers, she's one of my favorite authors of all time. Her Lineage of Grace series, as well as her Mark of the Lion series and Redeeming Love by her, are awesome. But I find that a lot of Christian fiction, I hate to say this because I know some people who watch me love Christian fiction and that's the only thing that they read, but a lot of Christian fiction I have found are just like very corny and very surface level and fluffy. And they try to have depth, but I just don't find that they do have depth. I find it to be very surface level and like corny and cheesy and just very forceful in a way. Like they try to put Christian like themes and aspects into the book, but it ends up feeling like forced, like they are trying too hard to put that kind of stuff in their books. And that's how I felt about The Lost Boys of Barlow Theater. I found that a lot of the elements of the book were just super forced in terms of like them trying to mention prayer or mentioning God or mentioning going to church and things of that nature. I'm like, it just felt like it was trying too hard, if that makes sense. And then also like just the overall execution of the book was a little lackadaisical in the way that the premise sounded really interesting. So may I just mention, Jamie Jo Wright is technically like a Christian fiction, like suspense slash thriller author, okay? And she's kind of known for writing like spooky-ish type books without having any sort of demonic undertones to it. So this book is basically a dual timeline book based in 1915 and then also in modern times. And it all surrounds this theater called the Barlow Theater. And in the 1915 timeline, it follows this girl who has lost two brothers to this theater. One in the construction, he falls off and like legitimately dies. And that's not a spoiler, by the way, that like is literally in the synopsis of the book on the back. And then there's also another brother who like wanders into the theater and just like disappears, and he's like, there's no trace of him, like no one can find him. But anyways, like the modern timeline follows this other girl who is like following these like ghost hunter reality TV stars, and she works in like the production crew essentially, or at least like in some aspect helps facilitate the show in a way. And one of the like TV stars on this like ghost hunting show like disappears in the theater. So like it follows both of those timelines, and the premise of it sounded really interesting because I typically like historical fiction. I like thrillers as long as it doesn't get like too demonic or creepy. But it just, the execution of it just like was not there. I found there to be a lot of like cheesy, corny moments, a lot of unrealistic moments as well. And I feel like it just could have been executed a lot better. So that was a really disappointing read since the last video that I made about my quarterly updates. But yeah, just really disappointed. Probably not going to read any more of her books. I'm going to probably just stick to like my Frida McFadden books. And then the next question number 5, is which book was the most anticipated and did it live up to the hype? And I would have to say The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, because I've seen so many people talk about this book. And this is like an exception for me. Like I'm not really big into like mainstream books that are like really hyped up on like BookTube or Book Talk or Bookstagram. I've realized within the past year like to not like buy into the hype of books and just read the synopsis of a book and see if I'm interested in it. But when people were describing this book, I was like, oh my gosh, like this definitely sounds like something I would be interested in, because it's about two sisters living during World War II. So yes, it's historical fiction, which I tend to like, and I typically am drawn towards World War II fiction. I know there's a lot more historical fiction out there, but World War II historical fiction tends to be something that I really enjoy. So I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. It definitely features like female bonds and sisterly relationships. Even though I don't have sisters in real life, like I have 3 brothers, I'm the only girl. That definitely did intrigue me because it's more of like a familial type theme. And it also is taking place during World War II. It's a historical fiction. So I was like, okay, I'm going to give it a try. And also, a lot of Kristen Hanna books are hyped up in general, not just The Nightingale. So it definitely gave me like interest to just read her books in general because she just seems really well beloved, and I have heard like really like no complaints from her books in general. So I wanted to give The Nightingale a check out because that was like the main book that I would probably be most interested in out of all of her books. And I was so surprised. I actually, as of filming this video, I finished it yesterday. And it was so amazing, like definitely very emotional. I don't really cry during books, and I did not cry during this book, but I definitely could see people crying during this book. A lot of people have filmed themselves crying during this book, and I've seen it on YouTube, I've seen it on TikTok, I've seen it on Instagram of people crying during this book. Even though I didn't cry, I definitely find it very emotional, and I was just like really, really surprised by this book. And it definitely lived up to the hype. It definitely was an anticipated read for me this year because I definitely wanted to read at least one Kristen Hanna book this year. So yes, I read The Nightingale. It was an anticipated read for me, and yes, it lived up to the hype. So there's your answer for that one. And then question number 7 is, what was a book that got you out of a reading slump? And I just want to add, like, I at least have like 1 or 2 reading slumps a year. It's like inevitable. So when I got into a reading slump back in like, I would say like July or August, I was doing this video. It's like a reading vlog. You can go check it out down in the description below. I'll tag it. But I did this video of like reading until I got a 5-star read in hopes that that would bring me out of a reading slump. And this book was in that video, and that's From Sand and Ash by Amy Harmon. It's definitely not my favorite book by Amy Harmon, but it was a 5-star read for me, and I absolutely loved it. It's about World War II, yet again. It, instead of taking place in like Germany, or The Nightingale was taking place in France, this book actually took place in Italy, which is really interesting because I have not read a World War II historical fiction based in Italy, because for those who don't know, during World War II in Italy, there was the rule of Mussolini, who was very similar in his treatment of people to Hitler. And then of course, like, Mussolini like got out of power, and then the Nazis invaded Italy, and so it was just about that. And also it mainly follows this female main character named Eva, and she is a Jew living in Italy, and it also follows this main male character named Angelo, and he's a Catholic priest, but they grew up basically in the same household. They like aren't biological siblings. Like, basically Eva's grandparents worked as like basically like a maid and a butler to Angelo's grandparents, and Angelo and Eva both lived with their grandparents because both of their parents weren't really in the picture. So like they kind of grew up like in a sibling type relationship, but they end up, like, of course, because they're not biological siblings, as they grow older, they fall in love. And it's like their love story during World War II in Italy. And it was just a beautiful love story. And I really, really enjoyed seeing, like, how they went throughout the war and the different challenges they had to face. But yes, definitely go give it a try, because this book actually, like, set in stone for me that Amy Harmon is one of my favorite authors of all time. It's my 3rd book by her, so like that's super exciting. And that goes on to my next question. Did you find a new favorite author? Yes, Amy Harmon. She, like I mentioned before, has written a number of books that I've read. So I've read 3 books by her so far, and I like to give authors like the benefit of the doubt. And I like to read at least 3 of their books in order to consider them my favorite author. And I've read 3 of her books so far in the past like year. And one of them was a 6-star, which for me, a 6-star like basically breaks the 5-star scale. And it's like basically one of my favorite books of all time. And then the other 2 books that I read by her were 5 stars. So of course, now she's one of my favorite authors of all time, and I want to read more of her books. And then, not necessarily a favorite author so far, but I can see her being a favorite author, is Kristen Hanna. Like I mentioned before, I did read The Nightingale by her recently, and I loved it. And I definitely want to read like more of her books in order to consider her my favorite author. And like I mentioned before, I like to read at least 3 books by the same author in order for them to be considered my favorite author, or a favorite author, I should say. So I want to read at least 2 more of her books in order to see if she'll be my favorite author or a favorite author. So I have to read more of her books in order to do that, but she's definitely on my way to being a favorite author of mine. And then the next question that I have here is, did your reading habits change compared to earlier in the year? And it definitely has. Like I mentioned earlier on in this video, I have been listening to a lot more audiobooks just because of the nature of my job doing DoorDash and Uber Eats full time. I don't really have time to read physically as of right now, but I have been listening to a lot of audiobooks, and I think that definitely plays into how many books I've been reading, because I can definitely, like, quote unquote read faster or listen to books faster, whatever, however you want to consider that, because of the nature of like that there are audiobooks and I don't have to physically sit down and read them. So I've definitely read or listened to a lot more audiobooks this year. And then also I've been honing into like what my favorite types of books are and like what my reading tastes are. So for one, I don't necessarily think that Christian fiction is like my be-all end-all in terms of like what types of books I'm reading. Although I do want to say that like I do like books with Christian themes in them, if that makes sense. So yes, do I like a lot of Christian fiction books? Of course. But Christian fiction books don't limit me. Do you know what I mean? Like I will read outside of the Christian fiction genre as long as they have like Christian-ish themes to them. So that means like having good versus evil, where the good wins, or featuring like unconditional love or friendships and community, or even like serving a greater purpose than yourself and like being selfless. And then I'm also discovering that my favorite genres are really like historical fiction, popcorn thrillers, and just like timeless classics that don't have like confusing language or out of touch themes, because a lot of the time, not a lot of the time, I shouldn't say that. Some of the time, classics have these like out of touch themes that don't necessarily like apply to today's day and age. So I like timeless classics where it doesn't really have complex or confusing language. It's very straightforward language where you're not wondering what they're trying to say, and also has themes in it that can still be relevant to how we're living in modern times. And then I've also noticed that I don't really like sci-fi. I don't like books with demonic themes in them, and I also don't like complex high fantasy. I will read, though, some middle grade fantasy, like Harry Potter, and low grade fantasy that doesn't have a lot of stakes. I also noticed that I don't mind having sex in books, as long as it's not like graphic, lustful, or smutty or spicy. It has to serve a purpose in a plot. And then the next question is, what books do you still have to finish? I don't really have to finish any books, but I do want to read another Amy Harmon book, possibly The Outlaw Noble Salt. And it's a recent release by her. It was released in 2024. It's a historical fiction about an outlaw trying to redeem his life of crime in the early 1900s. I also want to read another Kristen Hanna book, possibly The Great Alone. All I know about it is that it takes place in Alaska, and I really don't want to know anything else about it. because I do sometimes like going into books blind, especially because I'm trying to discover if she's a favorite author of mine or not, but I've heard really great things about The Great Alone by her, and I haven't heard anything bad about it. So I would probably want to read that by the end of this year. And then thirdly, I want to read another Francine Rivers book because she's another favorite author of mine, and I probably want to read her book, The Lady's Mine. It's a Christian historical fiction book based in the 1870s, and it's set in a California mining town, which really reminds me of Redeeming Love by her, at least in the setting, location, and time period context. And it's about a suffragette named Katharine, which is my name, which is really cool. And she moves from Boston, which I also live near Boston. So she's a Katharine from Boston, much like I'm a Katharine from Boston. And she inherits her uncle's newspaper and mining company, and so that's why she moves out to California. And then she possibly falls in love with the local saloon owner, so there's some romance in there. So that definitely sounds like a book that I would enjoy. And then the last question I have here is, what are your reading goals for quarter 4? And that would simply just to read books that I enjoy and not feel bad about like DNFing or not finishing books, because reading for me is a hobby and I want it to be fun. And then the last goal that I have for myself for quarter 4 is just to continue reading my 1 nonfiction and 1 classic per month. So this year I've made a goal for myself to read 1 nonfiction and 1 classic per month, and I've been very consistent with that, and I have been able to meet that goal every single month this year in 2025. So I want to just continue doing that because I feel like it really pushes me to read nonfiction and classics, because otherwise I would not do that. Not that I don't want to read nonfiction and classics, but I just don't gravitate towards them. So I definitely want to continue in that goal for myself for the rest of the year. But anyways, that's my video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please comment down below like how your reading is going so far this year. I always like hearing about what other people are enjoying in terms of their reading. Do all the YouTube things that you know how to do, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!